Right, Martin, if you can just give us your name and your position.
I'm Martin Bell. I'm Professor of Archaeology at Reading University and currently the President of the Sussex Archaeological Society.
Right, thanks. So we're here to talk about the Long Man, and we've done this fascinating walk this afternoon. Two questions that people usually ask me is, what is he, what does he represent, and how old is he?
Well, the Long Man is a giant and iconic hill figure. As regards how old he is, there are many different opinions. Some people think he's incredibly ancient, dating back to the Neolithic. I think actually that he's most likely a giant hill figure made in the sort of 16th or 17th century, and perhaps representative of a period when people were trying to convey the ancient origins of Britain through stories about giants and legends of that kind.
And why would that have happened at that particular moment in history?
Well, I think people were trying to come to terms with the origins of their country, how it had come about, and there were various medieval historians who wrote stories about how giants had laid the foundations of Britain, and I think this might be an attempt to represent those with this huge hill figure carved on the chalk downland.
And who were those giants?
Well, some of them figures known as Gog and Magog, for instance. Those are represented in the sort of legends about the history of Britain. There's no certain evidence that this is a figure representing one of those, but certainly the whole concept of giants is something which is very much alive in the Elizabethan period through to subsequently through to perhaps the period of the Civil War.
And so, if that theory is correct, are we thinking that the hill figure was created before or after the Reformation, and is that relevant?
Well, I think the Reformation might be very relevant because there were a series of martyrs in Sussex. That's something which is commemorated today by the bonfire celebrations in Lewes, for instance, and that's not very far away from Wilmington. So I think it's possible that's responsible for the creation of the Long Man, that period of sort of Elizabethan religious conflict is one possible context.
And any thoughts as to who may have created him?
Well, we don't know for sure. We've made strenuous efforts to try and find out who might have made him. The likelihood, I think, is that it's a local landowner who is trying to make his mark on the landscape, and that's another phenomena that occurs just after the Reformation, really, where you get private individuals taking over a monastic site, which we had at Wilmington. There was a priory there, and very literally in this case perhaps trying to make their mark on the landscape by carving this figure, and the whole idea that perhaps it may represent some mythical figure is one possible context.
I remember hearing a theory once, or an idea, that the monks created him and he's a pilgrim with two staves. Is that a possibility?
Well, it's a possibility, but it's not something that we have much evidence for monks creating this type of thing elsewhere. But certainly the figure is most visible from the priory, so I think the likelihood is that whoever created it was resident in the priory, and monks are one possibility, of course. But after the Reformation, of course, it became a private home, and it's equally possible that those people who owned that house created the Long Man. The trouble is there were lots of tenants.
I was going to say we don't know who that would have been then.
Well, we've got various possible candidates, but none of them at all certain, really.
So that's interesting in itself. Just briefly, what are the other theories that take him back to an earlier time?
Well, right on top of the figure, there are two Neolithic long barrows, and that attracted lots of people to the idea that it might be really early. There are also Bronze Age round barrows. People have suggested that it might be Roman as well, because there are figures on Roman coins that are holding two staves like this. Perhaps the most likely bit of evidence, though, is an Anglo-Saxon brooch from Fingalsham in Kent, which shows a figure Odin holding two staves, and for a long time that theory carried the day. Really, it was assumed that it was a Saxon figure of perhaps the 7th century or something like that. My own excavations on the site actually suggest that it's significantly later, probably 16th, 17th century, because actually when we did an excavation underneath the Long Man, we found no evidence that people had been using that spot intensively in later prehistory, Roman or Saxon times, but quite a lot starts happening towards the end of the medieval period or the post-medieval period, and that suggests to me that that's when it became a special place. We've also done optically stimulated luminescence dating of bricks, which we think originally picked out the figure.
And what does that mean exactly?
Well, it means that it wasn't carved right down to the chalk.
that method that you mentioned,
right.
What does that entail?
Optically stimulated luminescence is a way of measuring the emissions from particles under special lighting conditions, and the quantity of those particles or the amount of light emitted tells you about the age of the thing that you're measuring. And that suggests that it's probably 16th century. So that dates the bricks. The question is, of course, whether the thing was originally marked by bricks. I think it probably was, but other people suggest that it might originally have been carved into the hillside. But when our excavations took place, what we were able to show is that it's not deeply carved as everybody had once assumed. It's got quite a shallow profile actually in excavation.
So in that sense it's quite different to the Cerne Abbas giant in Dorset, which I think people agree has been scoured over time.
Yes, and that's been dated recently actually to the Saxon period. There's another giant hill figure, the White Horse of Uffington in Berkshire, which has been dated to the late Bronze Age. So the extraordinary thing is that the three giant hill figures in Britain that we've dated are very different in date. One's late Bronze Age, one's Anglo-Saxon, and I think the Long Man of Wilmington is probably 16th or 17th century in origin. But, none of that really takes away from the incredible fascination of these huge hill figures and the story they tell about the development of the landscape.
And presumably when it was created, and it was created for a reason that we can speculate about, but it would have to have been maintained over the generations, otherwise it wouldn't have been there for 19th century archaeologists to be aware of, would it?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. I mean, these giant figures have become sort of iconic, and they're cherished by local communities, and they've restored them over the centuries. At Wilmington, I think they've probably replaced the bricks and cleaned and removed the encroaching turf, more or less continuously since it was originally made, perhaps in the 16th century.
And today, are there modern groups who go and worship there or perform rituals?
Yes, I mean, curiously, when we were doing our excavation there, by chance, it coincided with the solstice. And as we were doing our excavation, we observed on the platform in front of the Long Man, there was a group of druids that were performing a service. So it means all sorts of different things to different people, really. And of course, it's significant in that way, really.
So it's a sort of evolving truth, isn't it? Because we can be pretty sure that it's meant different things for different people at different times, but all probably linked in some way.
Yes, I mean, those that worship there, I think, probably feel that it's extremely ancient, pagan, perhaps Neolithic in origin. I mean, personally, I think the evidence suggests it's significantly later and maybe more aligned to the religious conflicts of the Reformation. But who knows? I'm not. I haven't got certain proof about the date of this thing. All I can do is build up bits of the jigsaw which to me point in a particular direction. I think actually fairly consistently towards an early post-medieval date. That's from the 16th or 17th century probably.
Yeah, so they could be worshipping at a site of agrarian capitalism then.
Well, yes.
A mark of a rich man.
They could be in a way, but then of course it's equally possible that rich landowner is somehow trying to make a mark on the landscape by referencing back to stories about giants and the origins of Britain that are, in a sense, far from Christian in their roots. So it's quite complicated.
It is. And I suppose it points out the fact that historical periods don't stand alone. They're all linked. We think of the medieval, the Tudors, the Stuarts, but of course they're just things we've created, aren't they? Time moves on seamlessly.
And people reference back to earlier events in order to try and create or enhance their own status. I mean, I think that's one of the things that these post-medieval people were trying to do by referencing the giants, really. They were telling a story about the origins of Britain and its special identity, as it were, in order to establish their position in the world. So perhaps that local landowner at Wilmington was doing the same thing locally. This estate is mine, I've made my mark. Not entirely clear what the motivation was, whether it was religious, whether it was to do with the stories about these giants, or what, but nonetheless they made a pretty impressive mark, which of course has become iconic for artists ever since. The great artist of the South Downs Rebellious painted the Long Man, and dozens of other artists have done the same thing. So I think it is probably the most iconic symbol of the South Downs National Park, really,
and visible from the main road and from the railway line. So
yes, and well out into the Weald, actually. From places out in the Weald. I was at Arlington Reservoir recently, and there's a really good view of it from there. For instance, under certain lighting conditions, it really dominates the landscape.
Yeah, amazing. Just finally, on the walk, we passed by, and you've already mentioned them, the Neolithic and Bronze Age barrows. Perhaps you could say a little bit about how important they are archaeologically in that area.
Yeah, so the Cuckmere Valley is an interesting one, really, because it's got a particular concentration of these early Neolithic burial mounds. And I think what that suggests is that although the river valley itself is by no means as massive as, say, the River Ouse to the west, nonetheless it was a particularly important place for the first farmers. So in that sense, there's a lot of evidence for really well-preserved prehistoric sites. Not only the Neolithic long barrows, but lots of Bronze Age burial mounds and so on the downs there. Lots of field systems as well, which are evidence of settlements in the Iron Age and the Roman period, and indeed Anglo-Saxon cemetery just below in Alfriston. So it's a very significant area archaeologically, and of course we're so fortunate now that it's part of the South Downs National Park, and there's a lot of land in the Cuckmere Valley, particularly Cuckmere Haven, which is given over to nature conservation. So it's an accessible area where people can go and enjoy and think about these amazing landscape features like the Long Man of Wilmington.
And the long barrows, what sort of date would they be?
Well, they date from about 3,800 calibrated years BC. So that's the very beginning. I mean, we're talking about within 300 years of the first farmers arriving in Britain.
So they're almost monuments to the beginning of agriculture.
They are, yes, very much so. And they represent a really dramatic change in the landscape. Before that, we don't get any really obvious monuments. We get lots of settlement evidence and flints, but at that point people start erecting these big tombs, which are the tombs of whole communities. You might find 50 bodies in one of these tombs, and they mostly date to quite a tight period just after the beginning of farming.
And these are burials, not cremations at this stage.
These are burials, but not complete bodies, actually. In them you find tombs with a whole collection of skulls and bones not laid out as complete bodies. And what they were doing, in fact, was exposing bodies, perhaps to birds and animals, and then collecting up the bones and putting them in the tomb. And then every now and again they seem to have opened up the tombs, taken some of the bones out, taken them to a settlement, because occasionally we find bits of bodies in the settlements, and then they put them back in the tombs. So there's this great dialogue going on between the tomb and the settlement of the community.
Wow.
As they sort of involve the dead in the community life of the living. But the tomb becomes the sort of focal point of the community. So they moved around, perhaps seasonally, round these tombs. So there's far more concrete evidence of the tombs at places like Wilmington than there is for the settlement sites, where most of the evidence really is scatters of flint work, perhaps for a temporary, seasonally occupied settlement.
Right, and so although it's a long, long time ago, as far as most people are concerned, in a sense that was the start of modern humans compared to how humans had lived before that.
Well, farming was certainly a really significant change. I don't think it's the start of modern humans, because the origin of modern humans goes back very much earlier.
Yeah, I think I meant sort of culturally rather than biologically.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that either, because actually people in the Paleolithic, the people that created the cave art in the Pyrenees, were just as intellectually capable in terms of their thought processes as we are. There's really no difference. But what you get with the beginnings of farming is people able to specialise and accumulate resources and store food in a way that enables them to do all sorts of other things. But I don't think their intellectual abilities were any different, really.
Interesting. And then the distinction between the long barrow and the round barrow, then, in terms of the culture of the people who created them and the dating.
Yes, well, the round barrows are essentially Bronze Age, early to Middle Bronze Age, and they reflect a very different sort of burial practice, actually.
And what date would that be?
Well, about 2300 to 1500 Cal BC again, before Christ. And those are individual burials. Some of them are inhumations, that's crouched bodies. Some of them are cremated bodies in urns. But basically you've got an individual being interred in a monument. Usually they will have one perhaps big rich burial, and we saw at Wilmington one really massive barrow on top of the hill, which will have the burial of a very significant individual in it. Often other people were put into the same barrows later, but it's very much sort of individual burials rather than the collective burial that characterises the Neolithic.
So it's sort of emphasising hierarchy and status.
Yes, I think there's a big difference in the Bronze Age in the wealth reflected in these burials. So you get some very rich burials. At Hove, for instance, in Sussex, there's a burial was found with a really beautiful amber cup. That's a very, very rich burial. And then you get others which are just somebody stuck in an urn without any grave goods. So certainly there's a difference in status and hierarchy emerging in the Bronze Age, which actually we don't see in the Neolithic. And that's a real puzzle, actually, because you've got the making of these big barrows, and then later in the Neolithic you've got making of henges and huge mounds like Silbury Hill, but we don't actually have, certainly in the early Neolithic, any evidence of sort of high status, powerful individuals that could have coordinated these things. That's one of the great puzzles of archaeology, really.
The burial at Whitehawk, where there's a female burial, isn't that Neolithic?
It is, yes. That's in a very different context, and that's in a causewayed enclosure, which is perhaps, well, you might see them as settlement sites, but they're more often thought of as sort of fair sites or congregating places. And sometimes you do find bodies in the ditches of causewayed enclosures, and those do tend to be complete bodies actually, but also in those ditches you find bits of other people who might have originally been buried in the barrows.
So was she? But she was presumably an important person to be buried like that.
Well, probably, yes. I mean, it's difficult to tell because I don't, from memory, I don't think that person is necessarily associated with any grave goods that instantly tell us anything about status. But certainly Whitehawk is a very important Neolithic site, one of the most important causewayed enclosures in Britain, really. Sadly, unfortunately, quite damaged now by the making of the racecourse and roads and stuff like that. But there's been a lot of very good archaeological work done there.
So just to finish, Martin, perhaps you'd like to say a few words about the Sussex Archaeological Society and how people can get involved or join.
Yeah, I mean, the Sussex Archaeological Society is just celebrating its 175 years of existence, and it owns the Long Man of Wilmington, but also Mickleham Priory, Lewes Castle, Fishbourne Roman Palace. And it's one way of where local people can get involved in archaeology, find out about the latest discoveries, and of course visit the museums at Barbican House, Lewes and Fishbourne Roman Palace to learn more about archaeology. Thanks.
Very good. Thank you.